Everyone. So today, the careers for historians, today this is collaboration. So I looked into the AHA career diversity side, the collaboration skill, especially with people who might not share your worldview. That's the guts of the collaboration skill. So I'm interested in hearing from Andrew. So Andrew Marcum, so he has a PhD in American Studies at the University of New Mexico, and you've done dissertation research fellowship at the National Museum of American History, right?
Mm-hmm.
And did you work with Catherine Ott?
I did, yeah.
Okay, she'll be coming here for the Presser conference March 8th.
Oh,
for the
cool.
keynote speaker, so you might say hi to her.
Oh, which conference is that?
The history one. I'll let you know the detail.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I'll reach out to her and make sure to say hello again.
Yeah.
She may not know I'm still here.
Okay. So you've done a postdoc at the UBCDS Center for Disability Studies, right? And you worked with Dr. Rentis for a couple of years. Yeah. So that's how he gets to here all the way from New Mexico. So he's currently a program coordinator at the Center for Self-Advocacy in Buffalo, New York. And he's also adjunct professor of disability studies at the CUNY. So he's a member of Buffalo Transit Riders United, where he advocates for accessible, affordable, and reliable public transit for the Buffalo-Niagara region. And he also serves on the advisory committee for the Erie County Office for People with Disabilities, as well as the Voice Buffalo Task Force on Accessibility. And you got the PPG fellowship as well, right? So he has tons of experience in nonprofit. So, Andrew.
So thank you for allowing me to join you today. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm looking forward to getting to know all of you a little bit more as we move through our topic on collaboration today. I thought I would start by just giving you a little bit of overview, a little bit more background about me and the work that I do and how I came to do that work, just so you can have an understanding of how what your options might be as you progress forward in your careers. When I was finishing up my PhD and I was presenting at like the American Historical Association and thinking about future career plans, often people that were in American studies or in history fields and the humanities, some of the options like when I was at the Smithsonian were things like, you could be a historian at the Air Force or the CIA, or you can work for different cities and work for city planners, and like it kind of, and I think those are valid options, and it kind of opened up my mind to the possibility of like, yeah, it doesn't just have to be within the academy that you can use your knowledge. You can use your knowledge for public service as well. And although I was primarily trained and mentored by historians, my actual degree and training per se is in American Studies, which is cultural and area studies. And so I'm trained to look at and analyze different kinds of materials, which can, as you know, well be applied to history archives and archival work, but can also be applied to, in my case, looking at how do we understand people with disabilities. Like, how do we think about people with disabilities and talk about people with disabilities, and how does that result in public policy around people with disabilities and how we deal with it? So, so when I first came here to UB, I was thinking of my career going kind of down a more traditional trajectory. Like I was going to do this research fellowship, and then coming out of the field of American Studies and Disability Studies, we're always encouraged to think about our scholarship in terms of how it can actually have a real impact on people's lives and create change within our community. And yet our training and so much of our world when we're in that grad school world is all about just the academy. Right? It's about doing that research, getting it published, meeting the right people, going to the conferences. And so in the midst of all that, we don't often, even though we talk about, scholarship that's socially relevant, we don't often think about how does that actually translate into a nonprofit job or a job in city government. And then also a parallel conversation is how do we continue to do our own academic work in that context. So over the last 3-4 years, I've published a few articles and I've done research getting published, even though I'm an adjunct and I'm still teaching, I'm still doing the kind of academic work I want, but I got to pay the bills. But I want to pay the bills in a way that's relevant to my education. Because I spent 10 years getting a PhD. I don't want to I want to use that knowledge, in a meaningful way and do work that's meaningful for me. And for me, that means serving people with disabilities. So finding ways to use my knowledge about disability history and understanding of the social, political, and historical dynamics of disability to talk to policymakers about why we need to pay attention to disability, when it comes to public transit. We've designed a world for cars and people that drive and not for people that don't drive. People with disabilities oftentimes don't drive, but we haven't created a world that's accommodating for that. So being a historian of disability and a cultural theorist of disability, I'm able to do what one of my mentors used to call translational work. And what he meant by that was sometimes you have to take the knowledge that you learn in grad school and help people understand how it applies to their work as a city planner or their work as a community organizer or their work in social services. So a lot of the people that I work with in social services, they provide direct service to people with significant disabilities. But they don't necessarily have any background or any training or any knowledge about the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the history of disability oppression and institutionalization, or the power dynamics, the academics and scholars have identified between able-bodied caregivers and those who are receiving care that makes it so that those people who are receiving care don't always have their rights and their needs respected, okay? Now, if you're trying to provide service to somebody with a disability, it's really helpful if you do know that stuff, and if you are able to see that person as a person with a history and a culture and a context, right? So I see my role in that area as trying to help service providers understand that. And so that's been very rewarding. It hasn't been rewarding financially, but it's rewarding professionally. And it's actually created opportunities for me to do scholarship about those dynamics that I incur every day or that I encounter every day in my everyday work. So I just submitted an article for publication in an anthropology collection about direct care work and the work that people who help people with disabilities get out of bed and use the bathroom and get to work, and how we're not really valuing that work. Like we don't pay for it. Like these people get the lowest wages some of the lowest wages in our economy, and yet we have laws and we have a history that says, okay, people with disabilities have rights and they need to move out of institutions, but we have zero infrastructure in place for that transition to happen the way it needs to, because everybody's still in the institutional mindset, and we're not investing to the level that we should to make sure that people with disabilities can actually live in the community. So there again, and I mean, hopefully, I don't know how many people are going to read this article, right? But the point is that I'm still able to use my knowledge in practice and as a scholar. And to me, that's really important, because you want to think about, why do I do this work? Why am I passionate about this particular subject? And how can I use my knowledge outside the academy? And to me, and I was always wanted to make that case even when I was applying for academic jobs. Because because I believe that scholarship should be community-based. So when I was working on my PhD, I started collaborating with university administrators, community leaders, people in the nonprofit sector. I was teaching a course on social movements in America, and I was talking to students about change. In order to make that change like feel real to them, I gave them an opportunity to come up with a service project one semester, and it was a community garden, and this developed into creating a series of community gardens on campus and off campus, where students could garden, learn about change within the community. And it turned out to be way more complicated because we had to like convince the university to let us do this, and they were like, "You can't have gardens on campus. What are you talking about? We're not an agricultural school. People will pee in it and vandalize it, and it'll create all kinds of liabilities, and this is a crazy idea." And like, it took years, and now when I look at my Facebook feed, I see Lobo Gardens updates regularly. It's like an established organization and the university. They're putting up new gardens. There are students using it as a tool. I'm really proud of that legacy. But it's a totally different way of thinking about like humanities, in the sense of like humanities is about opening up our minds and broadening our perspectives. But then how do we use that broad-mindedness to like work for systems change and like explain to people why it matters that we have the garden that we build be disability accessible? And so I guess from early on, I was thinking about how I can collaborate with people, you know, both inside and outside the academy, to like use knowledge to promote change. I guess at this point I would want to open up things for your questions and hear more about what you do, how you're thinking about your work in terms of how it connects to other career fields and collaborating with other kinds of organizations. I guess one of the things that's been really eye-opening for me over the last few years is teaching at City University in their online program. I teach in the School of Professional Studies. So I'm literally teaching students who are like nurses and social workers and Medicaid service coordinators about disability studies, which is about thinking about disability not as a medical category, but as a social, political, cultural construct. And how does that influence your work and your interactions with the people that you work with, right? Mm-hmm. So that's been exciting because we're always talking about like, how do we put this knowledge into practice? So I guess that's what I would want to leave it at in terms of then opening it up to you guys is, where do you see your work in terms of a practice that goes beyond the traditional academic settings?
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So you teach for City University of New York. That's like 100% online?
Yeah, it's a large disability studies program that's online, and they do have faculty in New York City that teach like regular classes too, but they also have faculty in disability studies from around the country, and we have students from around the world that are enrolled in the program.
Any questions?
My very tenuous future trajectory is looking at Asia, but I also have an interest in prisons. And what I was gathering from your talk is that you're kind of operating as a diplomat in a way, offering historical knowledge to those on the ground who are interacting with people with disabilities. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about any differences, challenges, benefits that come from transitioning from an academic talking about or talking with those with disabilities and your work now.
Okay, so I think, let me just give some thought to that for a second. Because I think one of the points of tension for me has definitely been a lot of my work has been geared towards social justice for people with disabilities. And that's due to a couple of things. One is disability studies itself is a field of study that emerged out of the struggles for equality in the contemporary United States in the 60s and 70s. So people with disabilities, African Americans, LGBTQ people, women's liberation, all of these movements that were emerging at that time, people with disabilities were saying, oh, what about us? Like, and how do we fit into this picture? We are men, we are women, we're black, we're white. We don't have access in the same way that other people who are not disabled have. How do we begin to think and talk about this? So coming out of that tradition, but there's also a tension between, there's a suspicion of academics in the social justice arena, right, with people on the ground, if you will. It's like, okay, you're a PhD ivory tower guy. Do you really, there can be a kind of a tension there, but when you're able to, when you're in any kind of social movement, requires knowledge and research. It requires, information to build campaigns, to persuade policymakers. And so that's where you can, start to build the credibility and just be honest with people about, like, I'm an academic, but I'm an academic because I want to make a difference in the world. Even if that sounds naive and whatever, that's why I'm doing it. So, that's why I'm here. So that's why I encourage you to think about, so when you talked about your work, your interest in prisons, for example, I immediately thought about the burgeoning movement around criminal justice reform. And I was doing a research project for Niagara University. They have a program called Disability Awareness Training for First Responders. And they were looking at trying to get a grant for the prison system. Because we have a huge problem in our prison system where there's a lot of people with disabilities who need treatment and not imprisonment. And people with disabilities are disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system. Their interactions with police are often disastrous. Michael Brown was a person with an intellectual disability or learning disability, which a lot of people don't know, but Michael Brown's whole experience before his life ended in Ferguson was that he was a student labeled as a person with a disability, and that put him on the school to prison criminal justice encounter pipeline. So how do we disrupt that? How do we use disability studies and our knowledge of history and race in America to talk about those in a productive way that we can create interventions and different kinds of public policy knowledge around that. That could definitely be part of your work at some point in the future. Not that it would have to be, but just trying to think in those terms. And law firms and nonprofits and service providers, like the knowledge that you guys have, there's different ways that they can use the knowledge that you have. And like I said, that sort of buzzword for my mentor, translational work, I think is really useful in terms of thinking about, like, okay, here's how my knowledge translates to many different arenas. Yes.
I have a follow-up question. It's specifically about translating, and maybe you could talk to us about some kind of concrete situations that you've been in. Let me tell you where this is coming from. My first big research project in my first book had to do with a housing reform movement in the 1920s and 1930s, which was not ultimately successful in structuring federal housing policy, but it did impact it some. And in my mind, left some very useful ideas out there that could still be acted on. And I was involved in a low-level way with movements against homelessness during the 1980s, but I wasn't providing guidance to the movement. I think the pinnacle of my achievements there were living through riding a school bus all the way to Washington from Chicago for a big rally. So I harbored the idea that I would be that I could use my knowledge in the future in some way. So then I got to Buffalo, and the movement that I knew about had to do with designing new kinds of places for people to live, and it turned out that in Buffalo, I contacted people in the community who were activists, and the problem here was there was too much housing. A lot of it was crummy, a lot of it was falling down, but building new housing was not on the agenda in the 90s in Buffalo. So I thought, oh, okay, and sort of turned a different direction and my life became filled up with other things, and being an assistant professor, and but recently there seems to be some kind of a movement coming back to deal with the housing crisis nationally, because there isn't enough affordable housing in most places, and maybe in Buffalo that's going to turn out to be true pretty soon too. So okay, so I've been contacted by some journalists, and I'm now sort of sitting looking at an email query from someone at a left think tank who wants to talk to me. But my experience with the journalist was that he had a framework already in his mind.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And he had done some research, and in many ways we were on the same page, but he to some extent he wanted to kind of plug me in.
Right.
And so I didn't to some extent, but not that much. I felt like I was kind of moving his ideas forward, and he did, he did get the article published. It was a big long article, and I haven't brought myself to read it yet, but I'm assured by someone I trust that I don't come out sounding like an idiot. And it may be that because of that, I'm getting this new query. So, but I'm not clear how to talk about my idea. I'm not clear how to do this translation. Enough to please me right now. So I'd be very interested in your thoughts.
I identify with so much of what you just said, especially about, so a couple of things come to mind. One is that we should just acknowledge that this is not easy to do. Like taking our academic knowledge and bringing it into practice in different settings is really difficult, and it's time consuming, and the constraints of our jobs, especially if you're an assistant professor or you're already in the academy, man, it can be really difficult to try to bring that up because of the time and the commitment. You know, there was a point in my graduate studies where I was teaching 3 classes a semester, and I was working on fellowship and doing this and that. I didn't have, I was still engaged with the community, but I didn't, I didn't have time, nor was I expected by the academy or anybody in the grassroots to devote my time to doing that work. So I think that brings me to this point, which is relationship building. Finding ways to get to know those people that you know could use your knowledge, building relationships with them, really working with them on, this is the knowledge that I have, this is what it means. Showing up, you can't show up to every meeting or every rally or whatever, but you can figure out, like, who are the key people? Where is the key work? Where can I plug my work in? And then build relationships over time with people that are doing that work so that you have an understanding with them about what it is that you're bringing to the table and how that connects with their work, or how it might challenge and complicate or expand on their work. And that way, when the newspaper guy or person comes and interviews you, you're, to a certain extent, your reputation precedes you. It's a little harder to pigeonhole you, and you've gotten a little more practice at bringing your knowledge agenda forward. Do you know what I mean? So it just takes time to build that relationship so that people aren't making presumptions about what you're doing and how it might fit in, or they're not trying to just use your academic title to make a point that they want to make, so that you're kind of in the driver's seat as to how it is that your intellectual praxis can make a difference in this area. And you're not allowing a community that you're not closely connected with or in conversation with to drive that agenda. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
You're giving me a lot of ideas. I mean, it seems so obvious when you say it, but in terms of thinking about building relationships with other people who are in this movement.
Right, and I think you can start with some pretty, kind of even some simple, guest column in the Buffalo News, or bringing your information or knowledge out in that way when you feel that, it's worth commenting on, just to get your name out there, or going to a community meeting where the issues that you're concerned with are being highlighted, and saying, hey, I've been thinking about this issue for 40 years. I'm interested in making a difference here, and I think we can use this knowledge, and recognizing that it's going to take a lot of time from the work that you're already doing, so that you want to organize your time in such a way so that you can devote, because you can't do everything at once. There's such a tension between your obligations as a scholar and what you have to do to actually apply that knowledge outside of the academy. There's a lot of barriers, in just everyday life barriers, that get in the way of that. So you really have to focus on who are the people I want to get to know, what it is that I want to accomplish, and set yourself up with accomplishable, easy, doable goals, and build on those over time.
But also, when you were talking, it occurs to me that my academic network is national.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've never thought of that as a problem. It's just there. People that are interested in the things that I do are all over the country, and I see them periodically at conferences. The people that are interested in thinking about housing the way I think about it, that's not necessarily local,
right?
Either, and
right.
And why that I sort of saw that as a barrier, and I should just break through that.
And I think that your national connections can be an asset that you bring to the local community, right? In terms of bringing your knowledge up, and you can talk about it in terms of like Buffalo is part of part of national trends. Yeah, we have our own local issues, but how can we think about the challenges that we're facing here and learn from what other people have done elsewhere? And I think that's where your connections can actually be an asset. Yes.
So I have a comment / question that's kind of the flip side of, I think, what we've been talking about so far. And it's that I think it was yesterday, there was an op-ed published in the Washington Post that I probably shouldn't even bring up, but it was this gentleman named Max Boot making this argument that historians have done a really bad job of exactly what you're saying, translating what we do as scholars to the public. And, we should, and of course, part of that is we don't do enough military history, we don't know political history and all this dumb stuff. But then an argument that I saw to kind of push back on that I thought was really interesting was part of his argument was much of the history that we do now is too quote unquote esoteric, right? We research things that are too small and not useful or interesting to the public at large. And someone I saw on Twitter push back on that, saying it's okay to study these esoteric, quote unquote, esoteric things, right? And so one thing that strikes me is that as we're talking about this, we're talking about when you have research that has very obvious modern day implications in your own community, right? As you're talking about. But what if your research doesn't, right? What if your research is very hard to apply to issues that are going on today or in this particular area, right? In Buffalo, maybe your research might apply to something that's happening in Kenya. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
sure.
How do we do that kind of collaboration when there is no clear sort of link between what you studied or the expertise that you've gained through your research and the public or the community?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Part of it is sometimes there might not be an obvious one-to-one connection, right?
Yeah,
and that's where the challenge comes in. So just to think about my own work for a second, one of the chapters in I did a dissertation that looked at how historians present disability and the history of disability to public audiences. So I did a couple of chapters on different Smithsonian exhibitions. I did a chapter on the FDR memorial and the installation of a wheelchair there. And I did one weird chapter on this bizarre statue of Helen Keller in the US Capitol in her famous moment of discovery. And she was placed there at the time that she was placed there in 2009. She was the only woman in Statuary Hall. It's since changed. But she's the only woman there, and she's presented as a little girl. She's not presented as the fully grown adult, internationally known activist that she became. Anyway, what I'm getting at here is I learned all kinds of things about our country, our political system, how we think about disability, how our economic system works, just from looking at her life, which is something that might seem trivial. But when you go to her birthplace in Alabama and you see, what used to be slave quarters, and like just down the road is the county courthouse, which may well contain records that show her father was a slave owner in the 19th century. I think finding ways to make connections that aren't always obvious, more obvious. When I was working on my dissertation, I learned that one of the things I learned that was there's not really sex ed for blind people or for people who don't experience the world in the same sensory way. that's not really a big part of my dissertation, but it's like, oh, that's really interesting. Like, we don't think about how we educate people about some pretty fundamental things based on what their cognitive and physical needs are. And then there's this whole history of like institutionalizing people with disabilities, denying that they have any sexuality, and that has led to a situation where people who have developmental and intellectual disabilities are highly vulnerable to abuse and rape and crimes against them that don't get reported or acknowledged. So NPR did a whole series on this last fall where the rate of sexual violence against people with disabilities is like 7 times greater than for people without disabilities. So this is all just to say that like some of the things that you learn, they may not even be directly the outcome of your final project,
Right.
but yet it's information that people really do need to know and understand.
Yeah.
Like, how the heck did we get to a place where the rate of sexual violence for people with disability is 7 times greater than everybody else? Wow, that's kind of a public policy challenge that we need to begin to deal with. Like, and I'm willing to bet that most everyone here is doing research where they're learning stuff they didn't expect to learn, where they're learning stuff that they may not be publishing or using right away, but that might actually be really useful or might just have an indirect connection to things that you didn't expect. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, no,
I mean, it's a good question. I don't know if there's a clear answer to that, but it's just, it takes some imagination.
Yeah.
And persistence.
Yeah.
And I think one of the themes of the course is like, it's something like intellectual confidence, and I think that's one of the things we have sometimes struggle with, especially as graduate students, but even as professors, is like, we struggle, and part of it is that we have an anti-intellectual culture. And I think we have to be honest about that and recognize that we have a long tradition in this country of being anti-intellectual, of being suspicious of intellectuals, even to the point where we have policymakers demonizing children, demonizing teachers, because they're scared of that power. They don't want us opening people's minds and changing people's minds, you know what I mean? So we have to kind of like, okay, just be honest about that and say, okay, but that's okay because this is who I am, this is what I'm here for. Like, I'm playing a valid role, even if some, commentator in the New York Times or wherever thinks that we should be teaching more military history or something. Like, I still have the confidence to know that like what I've learned is really meaningful to people's lives. Because ultimately history is about people and people's lives and society and how the past connects to the present. And that's, it's not, I think there's a big misconception about history that it's just like a series of events that we document and confirm. And that's not what it is at all. Like, it's about looking at what the past has left behind to see how we can understand what's happened and how it connects and how we can get insights from things like public documents and campaigns and stuff to figure out, like, why do we behave the way we do? Why do we think the way that we do? Why do we do the things that we do?
I think I really like the point that you made about how even if it's like sometimes there's one particular small thing in your dissertation or in your scholarship that maybe it doesn't translate specifically into a job, right? I think sometimes we think like, okay, well, my expertise is in exactly this thing that I studied and this is what my dissertation is about. We forget to see all of the many threads that are in our work that connect to things that are relevant. So like, even if what you do is quote unquote esoteric, it still, I think, has all of these ways. If you think about it, sometimes you have to think about it somewhat creatively, right?
Right, yeah.
To find all of these threads, but yeah.
I have a different sort of answer
Oops,
to that.
sorry, I thought I turned that off.
So my field is Chinese history, and I kind of made a big effort in my career to work with teachers because East Asian history is not taught very much. I mean, I think we've made improvements over the last 30 years, but I spent a lot of time trying to help out K through 12 education. But it raises this question of collaboration because, just like you working with housing activists or journalists, there's a very different cultural environment in institutions, K through 12 and Iowa and research universities. And I think it makes it difficult to figure out how to work together, basically. And we don't have a very good spaces to work together in that way. It's one of the hardest things, the collaboration in with different cultural expectations and reward systems and all this other stuff.
Right.
So I wonder if you have any more general principles, or if it's just, try to figure out the culture of the people you're working with, respect their constraints, respect their, are there any examples that you could give of like trying to overcome those institutional barriers?
Well, one thing that just popped into my head as you were saying that about respecting constraints is that sometimes we get too focused on how we can respect other people's constraints, and we forget to help them in a polite way respect our constraints, and understand where we're coming from too. So trying to think of a good example of this. So the research that I did here at UB was looking at the history of institutionalization here in Western New York. And so one of the things that came out of that was I became connected with a small group of people that were looking to move disability services from the old institution at West Seneca, which was deliberately isolated from the community, to a setting in the community. And so the constraints that they were facing in doing that had to do with the state didn't want to invest money in a new office. They had a whole bunch of union jobs out at the old facility. They had community members in West Seneca that was afraid of the institution moving out because it might mean job loss, or they were afraid what's going to happen with the land. Who's going to come in here and gentrify? Are we going to have control over the land? And so there were a whole lot of different things that could make you like kind of throw up your hands and say this isn't doable. But we started doing research. I mean, I shared my research on the experiences of people who live there. And it was a pretty powerful tool for changing minds at the public policy level, for advocating, for getting the activists to understand how they could use history and what happened in the past to make their case for moving the center. But we also were able to do things like file freedom of information request with the State Department of Persons with Developmental Disabilities, so that we could actually get a hold of the documents that they were using to argue about cost and this and that, so that we could like refute those. And that actually, it takes the academic skills that you have to be able to. Sometimes we forget how useful our academic skills are in terms of being able to analyze information, interpret information, read a lot of information. I mean, goodness knows one of the things we learned to do really well in grad school is read a lot of stuff. And a lot of the stuff that we read is really, really difficult and really, really hard. And so when we're looking at public documents and stuff, that can be like a cakewalk. And like we have the ability as scholars to like read and interpret massive amounts of information that other people don't have that skill or training necessarily. And like we can use that information or those abilities to really build compelling cases for change. And when we do that, the relationship part and the collaboration part becomes much easier because that translational work happens in the process of our being generous with our academic skills, in terms of saying, yeah, this, I can review this antiquated law, and even though I'm not a lawyer, like I have the interpretive and analytical skills and reading skills, the literacy to be able to then translate that to people with developmental or intellectual disabilities who may not have ever had the opportunity or may not ever be in a position where they can analyze that and then connect. And then I have the ability to help them understand how that connects with their own experience when when their needs and expectations are dismissed by staff or not listened to by staff. That's not their imagination. It's part of the history. It's part of the way we think about disability. So I guess, I don't know, I feel like I'm just going on here, but it's really about thinking about what else you learned from your education besides just information or history, but even like the practical skills of like communication, analyzing information, listening, like those things are surprisingly lacking in other arenas, and you can bring that to the table.
I want to add a couple of things in terms of skills that you're actually thinking about. I'm positive, but you just haven't brought out as much as kind of reading and analysis. I mean, the first thing, and you touched on it, with the Freedom of Information Act, is finding the things to read.
Right.
And that's one thing that we do learn in the academy.
How to use the library, how to use databases.
Just discovering the text in the first place, let alone figuring out what it means. And then, for those of us in the humanities, building a narrative or creating a narrative, which is not that most people can't do it easily. And, that's what a great lawyer does in terms of winning a case, and they're teaching that kind of thing in law school to people. But if you've been in history, that's just something that occurs to you kind of naturally after all this training. So I was thinking about that when Sarah was talking about the content issue, and what you're doing right now is saying, separate from content, there's skills level dimension to all this.
Which actually has to do with the skills that are necessary to build that content, right?
Translate it. But still, going back to the issue of these different cultures that Kristen was talking about, and how people coming out of these very different cultures talk to each other.
I think Gail had a great suggestion a couple of weeks ago where that, and I was thinking of asking this question about how you thought graduate training could be adjusted to encourage collaboration. And Gail was saying that one thing she thinks would be valuable for graduate students would be an introduction to institutions, like the state, how it works, how, and things like Freedom of Information Act. I mean, things that a more systematic approach to what are the policy institutions that you could actually engage with, and what's their culture. I think that's a great idea. I don't know if you have anything like that in your program.
The thing that we had in our program was a lot of encouragement to engage on a public level, and teach students civic engagement as well, and to practice that as part of our intellectual practice. But we didn't have a formalized, like what you're talking about, which I think is a good idea, because I think part of what that would do is it could build a bridge between those different cultures for collaboration, but it also helps scholar understand how the knowledge that they're gaining could actually be applied, to a particular agency, a particular issue. I guess so much of what we do when we think about government documents or those kind of things, we might think about statistics and economic statistics and those kind of things. But how do we help people understand what those statistics mean and what the context of that is, and how we can think differently about problems or issues that allows us to come up with some more creative solutions. I'm just going back to this idea of intellectual confidence. And I've never heard that term before. I read the syllabus for this class, and I thought, it's a really interesting idea, because it sometimes feels like we're constantly being devalued, or people are second guessing whether, are you studying what does that have to do with anything? And it's like, no, this has to do with everything. But trying to figure out a way to not get defensive about that, and be open to listening to other people so that we can relate or connect what we're doing.
You have to get back to your sort of the that's a question you had in general earlier. In terms of my focus in history is on 19th century moral reform movements, particularly that of the temperance movement in New York State, particularly into researching, but also have that interest in terms of being able to being civically engaged and working to help affect things. So I was wondering if with that, would you have any sort of ideas in terms of the potential types of work that would be out there that would be sort of relevant to that sort of
certainly. Well, first, I think that you should take a step back and think about why are you fascinated with this, right? And part of our graduate training is trying to explain to other scholars why our work is important. But we don't spend as much time thinking about how do we explain to others why our work is important. So if you think about why 19th century temperance movements mean so much to you, when I think about those things, I'm thinking about, first of all, it's about how people come together to make change, but it's around a specific public policy issue, which is regulating alcohol consumption. How do people interact with their government? How do they create narratives around challenges that they might be facing? We're constantly talking. We have a situation now where we're trying to do marijuana reform, and we're starting to hear some old debates about, how do we do this? One of my favorite things when I'm reading a historical piece or a historical argument is when the scholar says, let's take a step back and think about, this isn't really new. We can think about how some of this played out in the past, to think in new ways about what's going on in the present. And I don't mean that we make direct connections or that we engage in presentism, but just that we're engaged in developing context for what's happening around us. And I think your work in the area of temperance, or in really any area, can be a starting point for any number of conversations around public policy in terms of drug and alcohol regulation, in terms of how we address specific challenges that arise from people using drugs or alcohol, but also on another level, on the level of how do people organize to create a change? To create change? Why did they do that at this time? I often get frustrated with sort of the narrow. I think one of the things that humanities can do really well is like take the narrow focus and broaden it out for people. Because I get frustrated when I hear like politicians talk about politics, and there's only one way to do politics, and that's, get the right people elected and, pass the right policies. And it's like, no, there's so many other different ways to do politics, to think about how we can take responsibility for the world around us with the knowledges that we have in the places that we have. And it doesn't have to be, this narrow, fixed place. So I guess I would just continue to encourage people to think broadly about your work and with imagination about your work, and don't let anybody tell you that it doesn't matter or that it's too esoteric, because you wouldn't be doing it if it didn't matter to you. You're not going to waste you're not going to spend however many hours that you spent looking at 19th century temperance movement if it didn't matter to you for some reason. So it's really just a question of saying to yourself, why does this matter to me so much? And how can I explain that to other people in ways that they will understand?
This question has more to kind of do actually with your involvement with the Buffalo Transit Riders, in the group. My boyfriend has a physical disability, and he has had a lot of issues in the Buffalo area with businesses not cleaning their sidewalks.
Oh yeah.
Especially, in the winter. Is that particular group involved in kind of, because I've made phone calls about because you're supposed to call the particular municipality it's in, and they don't get back to you. And
so we're absolutely engaged in that conversation. And so one of the things that we've done as a group is to try and use our social media platforms as places where people can get information about the issue.
Okay.
So we spend a lot of time getting information from other cities and how they dealt successfully with snow removal, to say to the city of Buffalo, hey, look, here's how we can deal with this. Here's the mayor's snow removal plan. Why aren't we implementing it? And actually just putting that up as a public document, but then also documenting the things that you described.
Yeah.
Like literally taking pictures of bus stops that are just completely not cleared and posting those up and saying, this is not accessible.
Yeah.
Like you can't get on the bus if you're a wheelchair user or you have a mobility issue. This needs to change. And so one of the things that happens in Rochester is like they managed to clear their sidewalks pretty well. They've done it through private-public partnerships and through getting different kinds of equipment. And one of the big things that they did recently was they had farmers who weren't using their equipment in the wintertime use like their small tractors and stuff to plow the snow off the streets of Rochester. Is that, we need to be thinking about those kind of things here in Buffalo. So I think going back to what we talked about earlier in terms of scholarly skills, like using those skills to like get that information, analyze that information. It's so useful to have that scholarly background when the NFTA is building a $10 million pedestrian ramp to Key Bank Arena. And all of a sudden, you see the newspapers reporting that the costs are skyrocketing, and the explanation that the NFTA gives is, we didn't realize it was going to cost so much. We started digging, and we ran into some electrical lines and some water lines, and you're thinking, okay, wait a minute, how did they not know that those lines were there? There was a disconnect somewhere. Somebody in the policymaking apparatus decided it'd be a good idea to move forward with this because Key Bank wants it, but they didn't connect with the people at the city level who are doing the electrical and the sewage and all this to say, is this an actual viable plan? Like, that's where like some scholarly intervention is useful.
Separate from being a scholar, just as a taxpayer, why is it that my tax money is going into building something for Key Bank?
Right. No, exactly. And we have an amendment to the Constitution for the progressive income tax. We have, a whole long history of people organizing in this country for a fair tax system that makes sure that their money, gets spent for what we need as a public, but yet we still face these situations. So it's surprising when you bring up those facts, how many people will go, I didn't know that, or I never heard that before. And because maybe you may not always have the opportunity to talk about it outside of a college classroom, but when you do, you can.
And I've come across people in the public that think, oh, well, why doesn't someone that has a physical disability just use is it called paratransit?
Yeah, paratransit,
it's different in every city. And it's like, well, even if you have a disability, doesn't necessarily mean you qualify for that. And people think that, those people can just call it up and get a ride anywhere, to the movies
Right, which is not the case, because it's on the regular bus line. Yeah. So it only goes within 3/4 of a mile of the regular bus. Mm-hmm. It's also incredibly expensive. It's $8 a ride if you do a full round trip. It's almost $80 a month for, I think, 10 rides or something like that. Mm-hmm. And, if you're dependent on Medicaid or Social Security disability, if you have limited income, it's expensive, and then it's not reliable. The NFTA has not invested in getting enough vans to handle the population. So they've seen this population of people that rely on paratransit go way high, in part because of deinstitutionalization and the focus on getting people in the community. Well, again, how do you get people in the community when you don't invest in the infrastructure that's necessary to get people in the community, right? So yeah, paratransit is separate and unequal, and some people are going to need. We need a variety of different transportation options, but what we really need is a transportation system that can meet everybody's needs, and isn't just focused on meeting the needs of people who can afford to live in the suburbs and commute in a car. And that's a lot harder to. Right now, our transportation planning apparatus, which is the current system was created in the 1970s by the federal government. They created a system where all the federal dollars that go to local transportation, you can't spend those dollars unless you have a planning board of people that specifies how those dollars are going to be spent, and they have to inform the public of how those dollars are going to be spent. So the latest reports, I think, were out either last April or the April before. I think it was last April. But one of the things I learned in looking over that data was actually the transportation planners have a completely separate planning process for meeting the people who have disability needs. So instead of looking at people with disability as part of the regular transportation system, they have a completely different separate planning process that's called Human Services Transportation Plan or something like that. And I'm thinking okay, no, this isn't going to work. If we think of people with disabilities as you shouldn't be on the bus, I just found it kind of astonishing. Mm-hmm. And I probably would have never have come across that information if I was not, involved with Buffalo Transit Riders.
So I think you've done so many rewarding, successful collaboration work with other people, other organizations before. Mm-hmm. But what was the most challenging one you've done? and why was it challenging, and how did you solve that challenge?
I mean, what I talked about earlier with the student gardens, I mean, it really
yeah.
took years and years, and it got a lot of backlash.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think of, I don't think we came up with a clear solution except just persistence and building sustainability, so that when I was gone, there were people there to pick up the work and continue to work.
Did you implement any, like what you say, gives them like a clear instruction, or they came up with any kind of?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that we did when we started getting pushback was we used our courses for students as an opportunity for students to do research on the benefits of these gardens, on how they could be done in a practical way, on what resources were available to the university to make it happen, on best practices where other universities had already done something similar. So we used the classroom as a place where, you know, we could investigate the concerns that were being raised in order to create knowledge that could address those concerns in a compelling way. I mean, one of the things that we did over and over again was we would say to university administrators, you have a 3-pronged mission according to your charter. Your mission is education, your mission is public health, and what was the third one? Oh man, public health, education, and I guess civic engagement maybe was the third one. But it was 3 things that so clearly connected in the space of the garden, because it was about, you know, building that garden was about building healthier communities, helping people understand where their food comes from. In a place where 80% of our food comes from somewhere else, we're having this huge environmental impact in the ways that we get food. And it was about public service in the sense that, you know, we're trying to build a community that's concerned with people's needs. And it's, you know, so that was a way in which we looked at the at least the espoused values of the people that we were working with and saying, look, our value, this is how we connect.
So the biggest challenge came from the kind of university administrators.
Yeah, and the institutional thinking and the expectations that they had as to what their university was supposed to do. So, you know, saying things like, we're not a land grant college. Why do we care about gardens? Or, you know, there's going to be liability here without necessarily thinking about actually, you know, when students enroll in courses, they take on, you know, and there's ways to manage that liability, and but there's also the educational value that comes from that. And, you know, we can look for liability anywhere, right? If we're going to look at liability, we're just going to stay locked in the seminar room and, like, you know, never, you know, but yeah, I think it's I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah,
you know.
it makes sense.
Can I share a story that
Yeah, sure,
just made me think of? So right after we graduated, April and I started this consulting firm, which was a very strange thing. But we did this project, a collaborative project with the Buffalo Academy of the Sacred Heart on Main Street, and they wanted us to do this museum in their school and we had absolutely no credentials for this. Like they shouldn't have hired us.
Like that, yeah.
But one weird challenge about it, and I don't know if you've ever encountered this, but one weird challenge about it was that there were stakeholders there, right, who were invested in a particular vision, a particular narrative. And we were coming as scholars with a very different narrative. Like, for instance, I was tasked with creating this history of Buffalo timeline that would, like, on the top, it would have, like, the history of the region, right? Like, this is when Lackawanna Steel opened, this is when this opened, just to give context. And then underneath it would have like, this is when we had this principal, this is when we had this uniform, that sort of thing. But it would have this nuns who were, you know, kind of the teachers at the school at that time were really involved in the project. And I would put things on the History of Buffalo timeline, and they'd be like, "Oh no, we don't want you to put that on." Or like, we don't want to talk about the time that our students did this, or we don't want to talk about that senior prank that happened in 1984. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Whereas we were thinking, oh, that's the hook. Like, that's such an interesting story. Let's highlight that.
And that's why it's important.
And exactly. And they were like, oh no, we're looking for this vision of what this academy means. And that's, I'm not saying that they were wrong or they were bad.
Right.
It was just so interesting to see how there was that kind of, that was a challenge of that project, right? Is kind of squaring up these two different ideas about what we should be presenting about this school. So.
How did you manage to?
Well, that's really fascinating.
There was a very powerful sister that worked there, and she told me what to take out, and I took it out because I was not going to tingle with her.
Wow,
You did the right person.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that points to such an interesting tension between like what we understand history to be in its uses and what other people see it as an instrument for advancing a particular narrative.
Right.
We probably all remember, and I don't want to take us back to a traumatic moment, but I remember when I was in grad school and George W. Bush gave this speech where he talked about the need to use history to basically make people more patriotic. And, you know, I'm thinking like, wow, like, you know, as a historian, I'm thinking, or as a person interested in history and cultural knowledge, I'm thinking like what we want to do is like expand people's thinking and challenge them and actually make relevant connections to what's happening today. So, I mean, thinking about your situation, I'm thinking like, okay, how do I obey the sister and at the same time figure out some way to bring in a context here that will help students understand how this school got to be where it is, and how it is. Like, that's really challenging.
Yeah.
And when you think that her institutional base was herself and her friend, and the whole Smithsonian had to back off the display about the atomic bomb.
Right.
So that shows that even much mightier powers than you had.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's fascinating.
But I think that's an issue of collaboration, right? Is that
exactly.
we I think are very accustomed as scholars to work, like we are in charge of our work, right? We get to say what goes in and what goes out. But when you're in a collaborative environment, you are not the only person calling the shots, right? So it must take, and maybe you can speak to this, it must take some learning to sort of share, you know what I mean? Like share decision making or something along those lines.
I have a good example of that actually. And historians can be a little naive because I remember when the History Channel first started, they did an episode on the Boxer Rebellion or uprising in China, and they got the top people in my field to be talking heads on it. And then I watched the final project, and I was totally shocked because, I mean, in my field, it's taught as, an example of imperial overreach and a reaction that is somewhat understandable because these people were feeling for their livelihood. The way it was presented was a very traditional, the heroic Westerners with dramatic Chinese. And then they would have this talking head, and the historians that they interviewed would just be saying like, very factual things. They only did their factual comments. So it was not wrong, but it was not the way they'd want. So I actually got in touch with Joe Escherick, who was at the time at UC San Diego, top scholar in the field. And I said, Joe, I just watched this History Channel thing. I'm kind of surprised. And he immediately wrote back and he said, oh no, I was totally outraged. but there was nothing I could do.
Yeah.
Because he was naive, he said, okay, I'll take you, and then he had no control over that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think maybe now people are more aware of it, because that was right at the beginning of it. But still, I think this collaborative project, you have to figure out what your status is within it.
Right.
Or you could easily become a tool.
And I think that's a
Yeah,
really great point. And now that you brought it up, I'm thinking of all of these times when it's so important to get clarity on what the expectations are and understand where the other person's coming from, and to have that conversation way in advance, so that you're not in a situation where the sister is overlooking what you're taking out, but you've already had that conversation about, okay, here's what we know. How do we take what we know and what the skills that we have are that and do them in a way that respects the integrity of our work, but also respects your need to not talk about this or that, So how can, like I was saying earlier, how can we talk about the history of that school in a way that's meaningful for students, but also meet some of the pressures that the administrators are having? That's a conversation that has to happen in advance. And I think it's the same way when you're doing a film like that too. Is like, you can't assume that even if you've explained where you're coming from and you make your position really clear, which we're usually good at as scholars in terms of like explaining what we know, but if people have an agenda that's already set, that they're already intent on pursuing, we got to be aware that that's happening and say no. I'm not going to do that. I got invited. Let's see. So the UB Design Center, Inclusive Design Environmental Access, where I did the fellowship in collaboration with Disability Studies, they were doing some new, they were rolling out some new additions to the Buffalo bus fleet that were making the buses a little more accessible. And they were pretty great. There was some great features. But it was the production crew that was doing it was like all about, it was like promoting UB, right? It wasn't necessarily about having a conversation about accessibility. So one of the first things they wanted me to do was like, they weren't sure if they were going to have, I can't remember if they just said outright, we'd like you to get in this wheelchair and pose in this wheelchair, or however they put it. And I was like, no, absolutely not. And it caused a moment of tension, like where I had to explain to them, like, that's not acceptable for a number of reasons. And they got a little defensive, and eventually my colleague from the center was able to come out and sort of do the translational work that I was having difficulty doing, and she was able to say, no, it's really, really important that any research that we present is not, that it's coming from the people who actually use this wheelchair, people who actually experience the environment, because that's the whole basis of being able to validate and verify that what we're doing actually works, is actually working for people. So yeah, I think it's a great example. The point is, getting back to the point is, get the expectations clear when you're collaborating with people. Always have the dialogue in advance about, here's what my expectations are. What are your expectations? How do we make these expectations align?
That is a fundamental principle of collaboration.
Because I showed up for this shoot thinking, oh, Idea Center's doing this, it'll be legit. I don't have to really worry about anything. But there was this whole other element, which was the public relations film crew, which was coming from a totally different. They were like, let's just show how great this stuff is. Let's make it look good. Let's make it look compelling. And it wasn't about the research per se. It was just about conveying a specific kind of message.
Okay, I have one last question, so I comment. So, I mean, you've done the museum work, you got the dissertation research, so I guess I assume that you were interested doing museum work before, but you kind of interest went towards more like a non-profit community work. How did that transition happen? Because I'm kind of experiencing the similar thing and just want to know what's going on.
Yeah. So it's just one of those roundabout things. I wasn't so much interested in I wasn't so much interested in doing museum work as I was in the work that museums do, if that makes any sense. I was interested in the political and cultural work that happens when we talk about and present disability and present histories of disability, and how we can do different kinds of work when we think about disability differently. So the way that wound up translating was basically when I came here and started looking at the institutionalization and history here in New York. There was a direct correlation between how people thought about disability and how they responded to it. And then there were historical consequences that flowed from that. So when we started to deinstitutionalize in the 70s in New York, we had this long history of very prominent people like Dorothea Dix and what's that guy's name from Massachusetts?
Horace Mann?
Yeah, well, I know.
Samuel Gridley Howe.
Oh, that's it, Samuel Gridley Howe. They had articulated this idea in the 19th century that we could create institutions where we can care for people and nurture people and give them whatever limited education they might be capable of. And that institutional model eventually failed, but once it did fail, we still kept thinking, well, we can still do this care model. We'll just do it on a smaller scale. Whereas other states pursue different models, like total deinstitutionalization. But we continued with this institutional model. And so it's led us to a point today where there's still lots of people in group homes. There's still lots of people isolated from the community. We're under a huge amount of pressure from the federal government to lower our Medicaid spending cost, to get people out of group homes, to get people with disabilities more jobs, to raise the employment rate, to do all these things. And we're still struggling to develop the tools to do that because it's such a complicated problem. Because we just haven't built their infrastructure or the thinking to actually allow people who think differently, who live in the world differently, to participate at the same level that the rest of us do in society. Why did I start talking about that? I can't remember.
You were talking about your interest in museums.
Oh, right. Yeah, that my interest in museums was really about how we think about and talk about disability and what the consequences of that are. And then thinking about, if we thought about disability differently, how might that shape people's thinking, instead of hiding FDR's disability and insisting that he wanted it hidden and that it was this horrible, shameful thing. Like, what if we acknowledge that? And actually, if you go in the White House today, it's one of the first government buildings ever to be wheelchair accessible because of FDR, and the very earliest efforts at making buildings accessible, it started in DC, not just because of FDR, but because that's also where policymakers and people who had disabilities were first encountering what that meant when they would go to the Supreme Court and couldn't get in, or when they would go to a government building and couldn't access it. That's how that Architectural Barriers Act in 1968 first came about, was people in DC who were wheelchair users and had disabilities, they couldn't do their jobs. And they're like, why do we build things the way that we build them? So yeah, I mean, I do find it fascinating. When I went to the Smithsonian, like I got to see all these different exhibits, and I learned a lot about how they use artifacts to teach history, which I found interesting. But ultimately, my interest was in the production and reception of knowledge about disability. And how do we produce knowledge, and how do people receive it, and how does that relationship work, and what does it mean over the long term?
Okay, so any other questions? Okay, that's it. So Andrew saw never mind, that's a conference I can talk about later. So next session isn't actually on next Friday. It's gonna be on March 4th, Monday, and it's gonna be at Park 280, not here. So go downstairs to the big one. I mean, I'll send you a notice, like mass email, but yeah, Park 280, March 4th, Monday, 1 to 3 p.m. And then Dr. Henry Cousins will be presenting one, along with Heidi Dodson. She was there last week. Plus, there's a guest speaker, James Grossman. Actually, he's the executive director of the AHA. So he'll be talking about how the career diversity implementation grants work and how he started doing that kind of nuts and bolts stuff. Any questions?
Did you say 2 o'clock?
No, 1 to 3, usual time. 1 to 3.
1 to 3.
Yeah.
Miss her.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, I enjoyed my time here. I hope it was helpful for you guys. And if you have any other questions, feel free to hit me up. So.
Hey, Andrew, do you think this is beautiful?
Oh, thank you so much.
I know it's like the bag is too small.
The bag is a little too small, but
Yeah.
something tells me I'm going to use this
Yeah.
because I love coffee and tea. Oh, and this is a nice big one too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. Ooh, that's really nice.